Hey everyone, welcome to Dead Game News. Now some of you may be wondering, what is this? Well, a little while back, I announced that I was creating 2 additional channels. A Curse Farms Junk, which is just streaming sessions or anything that didn't take much effort to put up there, and Dead Game News. That channel was covering news on games being killed and made completely unplayable, since I still think that is the most important issue occurring in gaming today. I kept that separate from this channel since I figure most people would rather pass on it, but lo and behold, YouTube decided to unpartner that channel. So I'm circling the wagons of bringing it here instead. If you hate this, no worries, skip it. The other videos are still coming. I am, however, using this as an excuse to change things, so hopefully this is more watchable than the episodes that came before it. There's a quote, "Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something." That doesn't bode well for me because I've made a lot of videos where I talk a lot, but there's always room for improvement, which is what I'm hoping to do here. Dead Game News is now only going to be topics where, yeah, I have something to say, because I think this particular news is important. Also, that quote is attributed to Plato, but then I read that may not be accurate and couldn't figure out who said it. That flows really well in English if it's supposed to be in Greek. Well, it's a good concept. So, Dead Game News. I originally had just 2 articles I was going to talk about, then it went up to 3, now it's up to 4.5. I really wasn't expecting this many relevant topics to come up so fast. Once I step back and look at how neatly things connected, this is almost like the planets aligning. So I had to make this episode. So the first news article is a couple of months old, but the aftermath is still brewing. In December, the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment asked the U.S. Copyright Office to make an exemption to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to allow preservation of games that require an online server. When I heard about this and saw some initial reactions to it, I'm not sure the English language has a word for how I feel about this. Maybe German does. They have a lot of long words for really specific things. I'll describe it. Say you have a controversial topic with 2 different sides, and you understand the topic, but you also see that this is just one small element of a much larger system going on. Whereas this topic that's getting all the attention isn't even that important to this larger picture. Like, say this topic over here is way more important, but that one's getting so little attention, it doesn't even have sides to it yet. And to complicate matters, let's say there's a little bit of truth on both sides of the first topic, although one side has a lot more truth than the other. But again, in practical terms, this is insignificant compared to everything over here. So to even give an opinion on this, it's frustrating because you have to explain 3 other things over here to accurately explain your opinion. And if you only focus on this particular controversy, you've already failed because you're ignoring everything of greater importance over here. It's almost meaningless then. So with that in mind, let me try to explain what this news means as I see it. It gives me a knot in my brain trying to put this all together. This is probably going to be a long episode. Okay, first, let's rewind a bit. This is not the first appeal to the US Copyright Office to have an exemption for games. Back in 2015, the Electronic Frontier Foundation requested the U.S. Copyright Office make an exemption to legally allow people to run abandoned games that required an online component as part of the copy protection. Except when they did this, it specifically omitted online-only games. Because of timidity? I don't know. Well, that exemption was won, so now the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment is essentially asking for the exact same thing, but for online games. It's like a movie with a big loose end that the sequel has to take care of. Now, it's also worth remembering that during this time, the Entertainment Software Association came out and spoke against even allowing you to play games that had online DRM that had been shut down, saying it was hacking and a wolf in sheep's clothing and associated with piracy. Because if there's one thing we've got to do, it's stop people from pirating games that aren't being sold. The takeaway from this is the ESA is not your friend when it comes to being able to run your game that you paid for. So remember that we're basically having to fight the games industry itself in order to run your games, because we're in crazy land. This brings me to that half a topic I mentioned earlier, which is an update to the story. I was going to say expect the ESA to come out against this too, but the actual news beat me to it. The ESA has again come out against preservation for games that require an online server also. What a surprise. They released a 41-page document listing all the reasons they're against this. I skimmed through this and all it did was raise my blood pressure, so I'm not going to pick this apart because that would take all day and would get kind of boring for people, but I'll say that it is packed to the brim of half-truths and logically flawed arguments. In fact, if you're taking a debate class, you may actually want to read through this document because it is great practice material for recognizing flawed arguments. Just to give one example, they say allowing people to play online games they've shut down is horrible because companies can resell their back catalogs, like Sega releasing their games on mobile and making a kick-ass commercial to go with it. Okay, except that's not what this is about at all, because people who bought the original Genesis games can still run them today, and they were never online only to begin with. So they're trying to obfuscate the issue by talking about something completely different and then use that as supporting evidence. Disingenuous examples like that are half of what this document is. Some of this document is denying the problem exists, basically saying companies have a financial incentive to keep the games alive, therefore there's no problem. I've never handled Emperor's New Clothes statements like this very well. Fine, game companies keep games alive. Well then where do I find the official company solution and not some unlicensed emulator running Darkspore, Battleforge, Need for Speed World, The Sims Online, Warhammer Online, Shadowbane, Asheron's Call? Okay, you get the idea. Anyone can have their own opinion on something or interpret things in different ways, but if you deny reality in the face of irrefutable evidence, you're simply not having an honest discussion and are just talking to sabotage things. Yeah, sure, it's easy for me to sit here and make the ESA look bad, but look at what they're writing. Now, the sliver of truth to all this, like I mentioned earlier, is that they are concerned about people taking money based on running games they don't own as a commercial interest. And yeah, you know what? I side with the companies on that one. They invested the money into making the game, they should retain the rights, and no one should be selling unlicensed copies of it, even if they shut it down. Just because I think people are entitled to play games they bought, that doesn't mean I think they also get to own the intellectual property of it and sell it. But then they go on to attack the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment because they accept donations and admission fees even though they're a non-profit organization. So they are currently not profiting from running these games which they can't even show legally to begin with. And if this exemption were to go through, they still wouldn't be profiting off these games because they're a non-profit organization. To borrow a phrase, this document is intellectually bankrupt. Okay, so that's one part of the explanation. Now let's back up and look at this for a second. Look at how this entire situation has been framed. Basically, gamers who want to play the games they have bought are the troublemakers here, trying to skirt the law, and the companies who have invested all this money are simply trying to defend their rights. And the debate is, what is the reasonable balance? This framing affects the entire conversation. It's important to have awareness of this, otherwise people's views can backslide without them even realizing it. There is a term for this concept called the Overton window. What it means is as long as one side is pushing more in one direction on a scale of what's reasonable, then over time what's reasonable today becomes radical tomorrow, and what happened in the past becomes unthinkable in the future. The shifts can often be invisible, which is why I'm pointing this one out. If I said in the 80s or 90s, you should not be stopped from playing a game you bought, the end, I think just about everyone would agree with me. But now the conversation is way past that. The museum is saying we should be allowed to attempt to play a game we bought. And the games industry is saying, no, you shouldn't. That is a massive shift from where we were. Even if the side pushing back wins, that's still less rights than where we were. The shift has already happened. And that's really how I see all this. It's ludicrous this situation even exists. This appeal to the Copyright Office is Oliver Twist asking for more gruel. What if instead the discussion was, how big a penalty should these companies face for intentionally destroying a product that their consumer base paid money for? Should they just pay some fines, or should there be actual jail time for fraudulent practices? If this was in a different industry, that could be a perfectly reasonable debate. But because of how much we've shifted, that's completely unrealistic. Legal penalties for shutting down your game? Are you crazy? So yes, I guess I'm for the exemption, the way I'm for someone being allowed to start their car by turning the key. Should that be a big debate topic too? I mean, maybe if you're a drunk, but no, see, it's already started. The thing is, I actually consider my stance in a vacuum to be kind of moderate. I didn't change, the industry did. Some people go farther than I do and think the companies owe the players gameplay changes, or additional bug fixes, or lower prices, and so on. I don't think any of that has to be guaranteed. It's too subjective. You can't outlaw companies from making bad games, guys. How else are we going to define humanity? I personally think the companies should be allowed to do whatever they want with their games, except leave you with nothing after they've taken your money. That's the line I just can't cross. It doesn't matter how much the discussion keeps sliding. I'm never going to be able to accept that. And speaking of backsliding, I almost missed this part. Remember that exemption for games I mentioned from 2015? That has to be renewed every 3 years. So not only is the argument from the ESA pushing back against online games today, it's going to keep pushing back on preserving games in general every 3 years into infinity, the way I read it. This is not a winning strategy for us. We're potentially never more than 3 years away of having this all be illegal again. But let's get to the main layer of this, and that none of this matters. Not really. Whatever the US Copyright Office rules on this appeal, it will have minimal, if any, impact on whether you can play dead games. Yes, it may make things easier for a few groups working on a server emulator, and definitely for museums trying to showcase this sort of thing, but ultimately, all I care about as a gamer is whether I can actually run the games or not. To me, that's the only question that really matters. Everything else is just noise. I will take being able to run a game illegally any day over it being impossible to run a game, but it being theoretically legal for me to do so. When they even happen in the first place, most server emulators are created with no regards to the law anyway. They're largely niche interest groups, and it's not the laws keeping all these games from being played. It's the way they're designed to depend on a remote server. I don't know if gamers appreciate how lucky they are when they get a server emulator for a dead game, because it's incredibly complicated. To give you a comparison, I can only assume you need a lot of permits to build a Large Hadron Collider, and there's a ton of paperwork involved. Well, imagine if that all went away, and it was perfectly legal to build one in your garage. No legal interference at all. Would that really change much of anything? So all this commotion over this exemption doesn't change the reality of games being killed. They're still going to be killed, whether you have permission to attempt to revive them or not. In fact, I think the focus on this exemption is dangerous in a way. One of my favorite books and movies is The Andromeda Strain, which is about scientists studying an alien virus. And a bit of a spoiler, at one point it gets loose and may have infected someone near it. So they're trying to sterilize the room, which calms him down, but then another scientist realizes it's his body imbalance that's keeping him alive. So long as he's scared and hyperventilating, ironically, that's keeping him safe. I feel similarly about this exemption. If this passes, the public may think, oh boy, games are safe now. We don't have to worry. Everything's all better. No, it's not better. Games are dying at an increased rate, not less. It's getting worse, and this exemption isn't gonna save anything. Keep hyperventilating. Ugh. So that's the first news entry. Don't worry, these others are a lot easier. So next up is Ubisoft has released the multiplayer server source code to real-time strategy game World in Conflict. The multiplayer portion of the game got shut down in 2016, but fans were able to keep it going with the server emulator, so this almost didn't matter. But I wanted to point out that this is a case of the company doing the right thing. If the game had never gotten a server emulator, and believe me, a ton of dead games don't, while this technically wouldn't have been enough for players to run the game in and of itself, it's so close that I would consider this good enough. Now again, I have to emphasize this is not necessarily a sign things are getting better. In a previous episode, Ubisoft had a crapload of multiplayer-only shutdowns. So that's 1 victory and about 20 defeats. This is what you need to remember. This is not what progress looks like. Don't get me wrong, it's good they saved World in Conflict, but does the company as a whole really deserve a high five for this when they killed off the multiplayer for 20 games around the same time? And how many news stories are going to show you this information side by side like this? This is the only way to see the bigger picture, guys. And if you just omit this info, then what you have is a happy feel-good story that isn't very representative of everything that's going on. In case you're wondering, I'm really not trying to be pessimistic here, but that is not a happy ratio. Alright, next up, the online card game Scrolls got shut down not long ago. However, the developer Mojang announced they plan to release the server software and a patch client to be able to run it. So this is the very definition of an end-of-life plan, and it will no longer be a dead game after they do that. This is the absolute gold standard of what companies should be doing in order to sell online-only games responsibly. It's also incredibly rare for a company to do this. I can't even remember the last one to do something like this, although I think it has happened before. I'd say it's a safe guess that this is the fate for less than 1% of all online games that are shut down. Now, unlike World in Conflict, the software they'll be releasing is not open source, but you know what? If it runs today on modern systems, the mission accomplished. The responsibility to keep it running isn't on the developers anymore. Now, to put this in perspective, the fact that this is so rare kind of shows how bad the situation is. Say a laptop manufacturer found a defect where the battery would fry your whole system after a few months. All of them, every time. So the company does a recall and sends you a free replacement laptop without the defect. Would you say the company is being nice and deserves praise? Yeah, maybe, but isn't that kind of their responsibility in the first place? That's really how I feel about this overall. The fact that Mojang isn't obligated to do a damn thing makes this nice on their behalf, but why the hell isn't this the standard for online games? This would be expected in other businesses, but we're an upside down world here. Now, another interesting aspect about this is they do not have the patch client and server software yet, but they plan to in a matter of weeks to months. See, in a more sane world, that would be a good topic for debate. How long after a company shuts down their software should they be obligated to give users a way to get that game running again? 3 months? 6 months? A year? Because sometimes games go down and then they come right back. That happened with APB and SoulForge off the top of my head. I think it's reasonable to give companies a grace period, but how long that grace period should be is a debatable issue. But none of that matters because that's over here on the spectrum of discussion. And the reality is way, way back here with Oliver Twist. This is exactly what I meant earlier. And to the final dead game news story I thought was particularly noteworthy. Paragon, the online MOBA by Epic Games, is being shut down on April 26th. Now, a MOBA game being shut down is about as frequent as a car crash these days. But what makes this one so remarkable is they are offering full refunds to anyone who invested money into the game. Damn. I cannot remember that ever happening before to a dead game. Fable Legends refunded money, but only if you hadn't already spent it on game items. This is a straight up refund, your money back. Now personally, I don't like this because it's still a game being killed, but if they aren't taking any of your money, I don't think you have a leg to stand on arguing that they're obligated to keep it running. If there's no money involved, you kind of have the right to do whatever you want with your game. To say otherwise, I think would honestly be overreach and not very practical. So this isn't really something to be celebrated, but I think Epic has certainly walked away from this having no foul. And by sheer coincidence, one thing I noticed is that these 3 news stories managed to fulfill, in my opinion, each of the only responsible ways to shut a game down. Release the server code, or release a patched client to run the game, or refund people their money. I think these are the only options that don't screw people over, and it's frightening how incredibly rare each of these are. The odds of a company handling a shutdown game like this are a lot worse than that 20-to-1 ratio for Ubisoft. I've never seen anything like this related to dead games in such a short time span. Now, you could say that's a sign things are getting better, but again, I think this is more like the planets aligning. I think there's a decent chance it will be years before a publisher does even one of these again. It's just so rare these ever happen. Okay, so I would end this now, but I'm gonna go off on a tangent because this is what happens when you don't have rules. I've had this on my mind for a while and was planning on talking about it way off in the future, but it's looking like I shouldn't wait. Now, the obvious reason I hate games being killed is because I actually want to play some of them. But another reason that just makes all this worse is I really appreciate game worlds. I'm an environments junkie. Even if I don't like a game, I may really like the world it's created and want to see all of it. In fact, at some point, I want to take this to the next level and get as many maps as possible ported to something like Unreal or Unity so that you can walk around in them in VR. It would be a dream come true if years off in the future, I could get on a 360 treadmill and walk through various game worlds each day as though I were really there. This could be me! But hey, even if VR has no appeal to you, I've seen a bunch of games where I'm thinking, how cool would it be to have them repurposed in another way? I remember even looking at a Sonic game and thinking this could be nice as some sort of free-form climbing game also. Or a racing game map as a good candidate for some sort of zombie survival game. I like the repurposing of assets to make them fresh again. I'm certainly not the only person to have thought this way. Anyway, porting maps is a lot of work. Some games are much better candidates than others. DirectX 9 games have an advantage in that the program 3D Ripper DX can extract a lot from the video card buffer directly, and you can try and turn it into something that way. If somebody doesn't get to it before me, eventually I'd like to start on some sort of niche community focused on this sort of thing to get more worlds for people to access. I have no idea if that's possible with more modern APIs like DirectX 11 and 12 or Vulkan. But either way, I am totally not ready to do anything with this right now. I'm working on way too many things. This is something that's years off for me. And for the most part, that's fine. I can come back to this later. Old games aren't going anywhere. Oh, but wait. Publishers have been killing off a lot of good-looking games so you can never run them again. Whoops. I mean, who would ever want to check out this map? Or this map? Or this map? Yeah, these are all gone. So my point to all this is anyone out there who has ideas on how to rip more good-looking maps from online-only games, I would encourage you to pursue it, and maybe you can find a way to put that stuff in the cold storage so something can be done with it later on after the game is dead. The same goes for any dead or at-risk games that have great music. You can always contact me about that if you manage to salvage good music from a dead or will-be dead game. Though only if it sounds pretty good. I'll be frank, some of these games that die are cheap and don't have a lot of redeeming value, which includes the music, but a lot of them are good too. So I'm hoping even if we increase the game killing, we can maybe get better at grabbing some of the good stuff out of them too. Okay, that's it for Dead Game News. I hope it's a long time before there's another episode.